Good evening, my beloved. Really nice to be with you. And we all hope 2023 is the return of our Lord. But till that happens, we have lives to live. And someone once said to me when I was speaking at the fraternal some years ago, and I was introduced with these words: any time thinking about Jesus is quality time, never a waste of time. And when I was asked to speak tonight, I looked at the readings. The Sermon on the Mount was the predominant thought in my head. We are with the Lord, listening to him. Are we part of that crowd? It is only 7 minutes in time. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I will be longer. But there's a serious point in that 7 minutes. As we just mull over what was said in those 7 minutes by the Lord, how deep, how profound, how extraordinary his teaching is. And it was 7 minutes. And the challenge I give myself is this: do I listen to those 7 minutes? I have to be honest, I have loads of talks in a box and very little on the Sermon on the Mount. It's a section of scripture we all know. If I say the Sermon on the Mount, we all know straight away Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But there are not many talks I've heard on the Sermon on the Mount. And there's not many I've done on the Sermon on the Mount. Why? Are we frightened of the simplicity of the statements Jesus made? Do we think, yes, it's a Sermon on the Mount, we all know it, let's move on? Because we are looking at what discipleship is. I can remember a few years ago going to the office. This is not a criticism of the office, it's something about how I think. And I was asked to look around and have a browse. Let me tell you something about me. I'm not into books. I'm not a reader. And I was being shown around the office and being shown numerous Bible books by the community. And as I was looking at the books, I was thinking, we're only a small community, but we have written a book on every book of the Bible, and we have written stuff about most Bible characters in the Bible. That's impressive. But if I ask you, as a community, would you say we're more spiritual, more Christ-like, more dedicated as disciples than any other people? What would our answer be? I'd have to say the chasm between what we know and who we are is massive. And I'm criticizing myself in that statement as well as other people. And the funny thing about the Sermon on the Mount, it tells us how we should be and what we should do. It's about living who Christ is. And could you put your name at the bottom of chapter 7 and say, this is me? And could people say of you, yes, that is you? So let's just think about just some thoughts. I'm not going to try and go verse by verse or look at everything in any great detail. It's too deep for that. But the first thing I want to think about is something perhaps we don't actually take into consideration. Verse 1. And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. We are not told how many were there. We're just told the multitudes came to the mountain. Now, I've got quite a loud voice. You might not agree with that, but I have to say I can't hide it. And I wonder if I was talking to a vast crowd, would I stay seated? You see, it's not the best way to get your voice heard if you're seated. And Jesus, not just this time, but that's how he taught. And here's my question. Were there people in the crowd going, I can't hear him. What did he say? Can you speak up a bit? No, hang on. Because so many meetings we go to, the elderly say, didn't hear much of that. Or I couldn't hear everything he said. So was there a miracle going on of hearing? Because I cannot believe anyone going there would have walked away and said, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear what he was saying. And you think about that in terms of a vast crowd, that everyone, I would suggest, heard him clearly. Whether they understood him, whether they agreed with him, is another issue. But I can't believe people going to listen to the master would have walked away going, didn't hear that. And how many times when we read the Sermon on the Mount, actually give that as a thought? But perhaps there was a miracle of sound. Anyway, let's move on to the actual teaching. And I do lots of talks. And I have to tell you, if I was doing this, I would do it differently. I would put the Beatitudes last. And I'll tell you why. When we look at the 3 chapters, what's the most difficult bits to understand and comprehend? And it's this first section. Because what does Jesus really mean by happy is? And they're spiritual concepts. So the first thing Jesus wants his disciples to grasp is he's talking about the spiritual life. He's not talking about living good lives as human beings perceive them, though there is the practicality as we go through the chapters. But fundamentally for you and I, he's examining our spirituality, how we spiritually perceive. And I can remember listening to someone saying they heard a talk, an American evangelist said to his congregation, if you squeeze lemons, you get lemon juice. If people squeezed you, would they get Jesus? And the person who was giving a talk at Christadelphians said, if they squeezed us, would they get quotes? And I think that's so profoundly challenging, that the Sermon on the Mount is not about us quoting verses and saying, this means this and that means that. It's deeper and bigger. It has its place, but it's not what it's about. And the Beatitudes are part of that process. You see, when we talk about being merciful, that's not just understanding the words, it's how we live. And we are merciful because he's merciful. And that should give us contentment. The same for being a peacemaker. That's not in our heads, it's in our hearts. And how many times have we come across angry brothers and sisters where peace is the last thing they're thinking about? And in their anger, there's a reason behind it. They can quote this or they can quote that. Verse 13, you are. Verse 14, you are. Verse 15, do not let the lamp, you are. It's about now who, what we are. And when it comes to the statements the Lord makes, where are we in terms of who we are? And these blessings, happiness, is this me? And in some ways, that defines our interest or lack of interest in our spiritual development, or whether or not we want to be with Christ. Because if we don't say, this is where I want to be, this is who I am, we're not going to spiritually develop to a great deal. And the rest of this then becomes, if not impossible, but very difficult to live. Let's think about verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Now, do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And there's lots of stuff going on there. One is your good works in terms of our behavior pattern. And when they see our behavior pattern, who gets the glory? Do neighbors say of you, you're really nice people? And give a whole host of reasons why. And the most important one is never mentioned. You're good because you're a disciple. I can remember early 20s, one of my first work experience situations. And I can remember, I don't do this very often. I had a day in work where I lost self-control. I had a really bad day. I lost my rag. I started swearing and losing my temper with work colleagues. They used to do that all the time, by the way. And I lost my rag. End of the day finished. I'm about to leave, and my boss calls me into his office. I want you to sit down. I want to chat with you. Okay, what's that then? Your behaviour this morning was very, very poor. You were swearing, you were losing your temper. And I went, yes, I was provoked. And so does everybody else react how I reacted. You don't tell them off, but they don't call themselves Christians. And I can still remember that now. They don't call themselves Christians. You see, my work ethic and discipleship were totally at odds. I don't think I'm the only person on Zoom tonight who can say, never been me. Because you see now the challenge of this Sermon on the Mount in our everyday lives, in terms of we are that light, we are on that hill, and we're not on the hill listening, we're on that hill doing, or in my case at that time, not doing. Are you any different to me? One of the things I've started to appreciate as I'm getting older, when I look at the Sermon on the Mount, how balanced it is. You see, if I was asked to write my manifesto of how I see discipleship, I would say a lot more than verses 43 to 48 about love. I would emphasize the importance of love in terms of discipleship, individually and collectively. This part of a section. I would talk about the importance of the Old Testament. Christ does that next, but it's only a part. Things which are important to us are mentioned here in this sermon, but they're only touched upon. You see, what the Lord is doing, he isn't emphasizing just one thing. And he has the ability, he has the authority to do that. But he goes right across the spectrum of what discipleship is. And if we're honest with ourselves, there are certain sections we'll go, yeah, fairly easy to understand, totally endorse, because of the bits we find a bit easier to live by. And there are other bits then we're a bit more quiet over. He also tells us where things are in our heart, what we feel as well as what we think. And the funny thing about the heart, we know it's deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. He is not making us out as human beings to be better than we are. He's challenging us to live like him, not like ourselves. Verse 17, do not think that I have come to destroy the law of the prophets. I do not come to destroy, but to fulfill. When we look at the Old Testament, brothers and sisters, where does Christ come in? Is he the first thing we're thinking about when we're looking at, I'll use the example now, we just started reading about Noah and the things which are happening in the time of Noah? Are we looking at that just in isolation of Genesis? Or is our thinking is, where's Christ in this? Where's the spiritual thread that takes us from this Old Testament situation to the New Testament? Because I have a theory, and perhaps we can discuss this when we have discussion. When we read a book, we usually start at the front and finish at the back. I wonder if the Bible was designed with Christ being the very center and the very essence. Now, I'm not talking New Testament Christianity, brothers and sisters. I'm talking about to really understand the whole of Scripture. Jesus is at the forefront of that. So when we're in Genesis, we've got to be thinking Christ, not looking at Genesis and saying Christ is going to fulfill this X amount of time in the future. From God's perspective, I suggest that plan's already happened. So when Jesus says, I've come to not to destroy, but to fulfill, he's given us a mindset of how we look at the Old Testament. And that's changed how I look at the Old Testament, value it, but where's Christ in it? But one of the things these 3 chapters are doing, they're challenging my relationship with you and with other people. Let's move on. I'm at verse 22. But I say to you, whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, there remember that your brother has something against you. Leave your gift before the altar and go your way. First, reconcile to your brother and then come and offer the gift. How many times have we been to a meeting on a Sunday morning and we have issues? And if we have issues with someone, more often than not, it's their fault. And Jesus is saying here, before you come to God with your gift, the law, sort it out, the issue you have with your brother, sister. That comes first. That is more important than, well, I go into the meeting I've been in. Do we see our relationships in those terms? And that's just one aspect. Verse 27, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in her heart. Jesus is telling us how different we are to be made. I often, when I used to be in work, would hear male colleagues talking about females and how they looked. I very rarely heard female colleagues saying the same about male colleagues. Yes, there were one or two, but by and large, it's not what, for want of a better word, turns us on. We are made differently. And I marvel here that the Lord, in that statement, isn't just telling males the danger of how we look. He's telling us he knows how different we are to be wired up. And I marvel at that. I marvel at how he knows what we are in terms of our wiring and how we perceive and think. I notice this is self-examination he's talking about. Plucking out your own eye, cutting your own arm off. And here's the strange thing. I know my faults. Some of you may know what my faults are. But I wouldn't go to see St. John and say, Who do you know is the best person for amputation? It would be the last thing I would want for myself, self-mutilation. But how often are we judgmental on brothers and sisters? Oh, they should cut this out, they should stop doing that, we should be, and we're very, very self-righteous. But Jesus isn't talking about other people, he's talking about you looking at you and me looking at me. And yes, it is difficult to give things up which are close to our hearts, but they're for you and me to deal with, not for me to deal for you. And so often we do that, don't we? I'm going to miss the marriage bit out, being single, but I'll go to verse 33 about oaths. Is your word your bond? When you say you will do you? Can people say of you, when he or she says such and such, it's true? Or is it a case of, I wouldn't believe him. I don't trust him or her. But let your yes be yes and your no be no. For wherever is more than these is from the evil one. I think of James, when James talks about the tongue and how evil it is. And the Lord's telling us to be consistent. You've heard it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other. We notice the Lord's telling us there, the right cheek. I used to think this was talking about physical violence, but I've never ever seen that. You're a Christian, you, right, whack. Haven't seen that happen. Not saying it'll never happen, but haven't seen that. But he's telling us the right cheek. And the right cheek for a right-handed person is not the side you would punch someone. It's somewhere you would slap, like the back of your hand. And my version says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek. Can I suggest he's not talking about physical aggression? He's talking about verbal aggression. If someone insults you, someone says something about you. And here's a strange thing, brothers and sisters. I react far easier on that. If someone verbally says something, I verbally respond. And what's my defense? I was provoked. They said this and I said that. And how many woes have husbands and wives had where things which were said that should never have been said, where no physical hitting has happened. And the Lord is saying here, let it go. Can we? Do we? Now we have the final section about, here it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. We know in Luke, Jesus makes the statement that he prays for Peter. Do you think he would have prayed for Judas? Who's on your prayer list in terms of who you pray for? and pray about? Is it only those close to you, family members, brothers and sisters? But what about those you're struggling with? I mentioned about work experience where I lost control. In the same workplace, but a few years later, I was bullied by a manager. You see, he knew I was a Christadelphian, and he used to take liberties, little punches, nothing hard, but just to try and provoke me. And I struggled in work. And then I started praying for him. You see, I realized something. However uncomfortable this situation was, I have salvation. I'm the one that's looking forward to the Lord returning. I'm the one who's got the hope, and he's in a hopeless situation. I felt sorry for him. Didn't mean that he wasn't less comfortable, but my mindset changed, and I prayed even more. And all of a sudden, it stopped. It stopped. And maybe we have situations that there are people we are with who make our life difficult. Is prayer our first port of call for them, not for us? Verse 44. Blessed you, love your enemies, bless those that curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? I remember something Bob Lloyd said. Even the mafia love their mums and dads. And doesn't Jesus say, basically, that's what it's about? That it's not just about saying, I love those who I get on with and like. It's loving the person you're struggling with. And it might be a brother, it might be a sister, it might be a work colleague. How challenging is that in terms of where we should be as disciples? And just to finish this chapter off in terms of challenge, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So the challenge Jesus wants you and I to be, it's not to be like him, it's to be like his Father. And here's this lovely thing. He was like his Father. So yes, he is saying we should be like him. But what humility there is in those words. And instead of saying, I want you to be like me, to an audience that may not know who he is, he's saying, be like my Father. And by being like his Father, you're being like him. And it's now past. It's more than 7 minutes. I finished.